Joan Bakewell, thank you very much for joining us to do your personality politics.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I can't call you Baroness and I can't call you Dame.
I think of myself as a working journalist. I'm still working. I'm still broadcasting. I've got a series coming up in the autumn, which is going out. I do it on my laptop. And I think of myself as a journalist, though I take my role in the House of Lords quite seriously. But that's nothing to do with the titles.
What's wrong with being a working Baroness journalist?
A working Baroness journalist, yes. It sounds completely phony.
It doesn't trip off the tongue, does it? Let's talk about your politics. Let's go back to where it all began. Do you remember your political awakening? What was your first political memory?
Well, I was a child during the war, and the war itself was very complicated for a child to live through. And I do remember rejoicing after the war in the Labour victory. And I remember that we had a school election, a mock election at school. I was about 12, and we all took sides, and I took sides with the most popular girls in the class who were Tory, and so I voted Tory, and the school election went forward. And I came home and I said to my parents, "We had this mock election, and I voted Tory," and they both jumped on me and said, "No, no, no, we're Labour." So I went back next day and explained to the school that I'd made a gross error, and that in fact I was Labour. I didn't know what any of it meant.
What happened to the election results at school?
Nobody really knew what it was about. I mean, the Tories thought they were rewarding Churchill for winning the war, and Labour was sort of thinking it was time for a change, and that was about what it amounted to. But then, of course, that's probably what it amounted to in the nation too, because Churchill certainly expected to win and was hugely disappointed. All the people who wanted change were surprised that they achieved it. So it was a very, very cataclysmic election.
When did you actually personally identify with a political party then?
My parents they were Labour voting, but they didn't take very much interest in it. But we came from a family, I mean, both my grandparents had been factory workers. My grandmother had died prematurely from TB because they couldn't afford a doctor. So there were a family that were growing up in working class Manchester without any sort of facilities, very modest homes, no health insurance and so on. So we naturally inclined to the benefits of the welfare state. And as the 40s went on, it became clear that these were very good things that were happening. So in a sense, I very slowly, and as I grew into the sixth form, where I studied history, began to take sides with social justice. It was social justice that really locked me into the Labour Party strategy.
You didn't think you could be a social justice campaigner and vote Conservative?
No, the people who were really active for social justice, I think this is still true, is the Labour Party. And it is social justice that matters to me very much. I care about things like the economy. I studied economics at Cambridge, but there I studied with the Keynesians, and I became a Keynesian, and I remain a Keynesian. So it all tended to follow the same trajectory. I was interested in what the Conservatives voted for because I had many Conservative friends at Cambridge. But I was my tutor at Cambridge was Eric Hobsbawm. So that was rather
a celebrated Marxist thinker, of course, for anyone who isn't aware.
He also taught me to question things, not to just accept. He would always say, "Where's the evidence? You're saying all this. Give me the evidence." And I thought that's very good training for a historian, or indeed for absolutely anyone, really.
So you grew up in a family in Manchester. Did you ever have a northern accent, a Manchester accent?
I had a Stockport accent. I grew up because my parents were aspirational, you see, from these rather modest background. They wanted to get on in the world, and so they bettered themselves in a modest degree. So they moved from terrace houses into a semi-detached, and I've always regarded that as the biggest social leap you can make in the class system of the British people. I grew up in Cheshire and went to a grammar school. I passed the 11 plus, got a grammar school education, and became wedded to what education could do for people.
What happened to your Stockport accent?
It was quite heavy, and it's not a pretty accent. It's not like Liverpool or Geordie. And my parents, in their aspirational way, wanted me to get on, and they sent me to elocution lessons. They weren't very successful. My teacher gave me very poor marks. But when I got to Cambridge, of course, I went to one of the two women's colleges, and my contemporaries there were all very largely from private schools and from comfortable backgrounds. I mean, Newnham, in a sense, many of my colleagues at Newnham were the children of Bloomsbury, the bright daughters who'd gone to St. Paul's and places like that. And they had quite plummy voices, as a matter of fact. They'd sound rather market today, but I was enormously in awe of absolutely everyone, including them and their voices. And so I tried to get rid of my Stockport accent and remembered the lessons from my elocution.
Do you regret that now?
Well, I can see that it was rather sad that I should be so intimidated, but nonetheless, you have to be true to the facts, and indeed I was. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be one of them, which I clearly wasn't in any social background, though, they treated me as equals. I mean, they didn't patronize me. I felt very vulnerable.
Did you ever join a political party then? You obviously aligned with Labour early on. Did you get involved in student politics, join the Labour Party?
I joined the Labour Party at Cambridge and went along to meet. I met Dalton. I met Clement Attlee.
The Prime Minister at the time, was he?
No, he wasn't, because I was at Cambridge in the 50s and he lost the election in 51. Sure. Churchill came back again, if you remember, briefly, and then Eden. But I met him. He came to the Labour Club. He was very reserved person, but I was quite in awe of him, of course, and indicated my admiration. We had quite an interesting series of speakers who would just come along and talk to us about Labour policy, and we would have dinner and question them. It was quite a lively enterprise, not a very big club, as I think. But women, of course, in my day couldn't belong to the union, so there was no question of me making a bid for a political career or even learning how to speak in public. It was very much a male-dominated enterprise. I mean, the union was entirely male.
And how long were you a member of the Labour Party for? Did you keep it up all your life?
No. I lapsed when I left Cambridge. I was a member through the Cambridge Labour Club, right. And I left when I came to London. I then joined the BBC briefly as a studio manager. And politics weren't part of my life, although I always went for issues. I mean, I do remember marching against the Suez when the Suez crisis blew up. I didn't know much about it, but I thought it was, what I read seemed to me a disastrous decision by the Eden government. And I remember going to Trafalgar Square to attend a meeting. I quite like marching. I've only recently given it up.
Can I rudely remind listeners that you have attained the incredibly impressive age of 87, so marching even at 86 isn't a bad thing.
No, it was a bit tiring, and I don't like standing around too much. I had to find places where I could sit and rest. I marched about Brexit because I'm very much against Brexit, so I was and remain a Remainer, and so I did join marches for that. I felt very strongly about that.
People's vote marches?
Yes, I was very much for a second referendum and all those assorted objectives which bunch themselves round a concern for Europe. And I do belong to the European movement and Labour for Europe and things like that.
Let's go back a little bit to the 60s. Talk about gender politics a little bit, which you've become very well known for. Now, we've come a very long way since Frank Muir famously described you as the thinking man's crumpet. And I'm sorry to repeat that phrase, but it hangs around your neck, I'm sure. Can I ask you, though, do you remember your reaction when you first heard he'd said that about you?
Frank Muir was a very leading comic speaker, a very amusing, witty man, and I thought it was just silly. I mean, I just thought it was his little joke. But of course, he made it in a magazine and it got picked up a great deal, mostly, I might say, by male editors of the tabloids. And when people were sent to interview me, if they sent a woman along, I would say, "Can I beseech you not to use that phrase?" And they would say, "Yeah, I'll do my best, I'll do my best." And then they'd go back to their desk and ring me and say, "I'm afraid the editor insists that phrase goes in." So this hung around my neck for a long time, and it perpetuated a sense that I was really frivolous and that I lacked anything serious about myself. In a sense, it wasn't really any good in terms of, I take myself quite seriously. I mean, I quite like humour, but I'm not a humorist. And I found that was a curious comment, a label to carry with me, which I could well have done without. And indeed, when the feminist movement got really into its stride in the late 60s, I went to some of the meetings because I shared their objectives, and I was attacked by one or two of them and said, well, what are you doing here? You have no right to be here. You don't belong. And I knew then that was seriously distressing.
And you blame Frank Muir for that, for putting you in a box?
Well, I blame the culture of the time, which thought, you see, there weren't many women on television, so they tended to get noticed, by which I mean what they wore and their hairstyle. And that was how the culture of the prevailing culture of the 60s treated women, that they were to be pretty and attractive and wear nice clothes, which I certainly enjoyed, but they weren't quite taken seriously, unless they were deeply serious, like someone I admired very much, Barbara Castle.
So obviously the 60s was a huge time of sexual revolution, lots of other revolutions, but you've since had a bit of a rethink about certainly the sexual liberation, and you've come to the conclusion it wasn't altogether a good thing. Can you just explain that?
I have been misquoted about that. The revolutions of the 60s were really important revolutions. They involved the abolition of capital punishment, the divorce became easier, homosexuality was decriminalised. I mean, these were serious social contributions made by, basically, the Home Secretary was Roy Jenkins at the time, and I very much admired all those serious changes. Censorship was abolished in the theatre, for example, and books, Lady Chatterley was a landmark case. So I very much went with what were lightly referred to as the kind of freewheeling reforms, because they were seriously important for society. And as feminism grew, I very much shared its concerns. But of course, I'd been part of the generation which had been treated as, quote, a little bit of fluff. I've stayed with the anxiety about it ever since. And I've very much followed and sustained a support of the whole of the feminist movement and the changes that have been made over my lifetime. It is the most important social change that I have lived through, is the change in the status of women. And I've backed that always.
That leads us on to the MeToo movement, which I can only imagine is something that you've welcomed, or is it something you feel has been perhaps long overdue?
I certainly endorsed it and agreed with it, and I had many friends who signed up to it, and I follow it on Twitter and so on, and I read all the reporting of it. I'm a great supporter of the feeling that women will speak out and are no longer going to tolerate being abused, harassed, condescended to, and so on. So I rejoice in this amount of change.
Going back to the 60s and 70s, especially when you were your broadcasting career, do you think you ever tolerated things at the time that perhaps you shouldn't have? Were you ever the victim of undue attention that you wish you'd done something about?
I was the victim of unwelcome attention all the time, but so were all women. I mean, it was the nature of women and men in the 50s and 60s that women were passive and men were entitled to make passes at them, which involved touching, stroking, pinching. I mean, I was assaulted by a member of the government in a taxi when I went to fetch him from the House of Commons to come on the programme. This kind of thing happened. It happened all the time. And there was absolutely no question in my going to a senior person in the BBC, because they would be doing the same thing. There was no one to refer to, because there were no women in authority to whom you can say, can you stop this? They would just say, but everyone does that.
What do you mean you were assaulted in a taxi?
Well, I went to fetch someone who was a junior member of the government and bring them in a taxi to be in the programme. And they made a grab for me and had to be fended off.
This was a government minister?
Yes.
And you didn't want to tell the police, or you didn't think there'd be any point?
No. There would have been no point. They would have said, well, that's just to do with your private life. You're all right. There's he's not done anything that breaks the law.
Are they still alive?
No.
Do you think there could have been a whistle that not you necessarily, but other women could have blown at the time, could have not put up with it? Is there anything that your generation could have done, or were you completely trapped?
There were a number of predators within the BBC. No one knew about Jimmy Savile, by the way, at that time, although we all thought he was extremely weird. But there was someone who was persistently harassing a whole department of women, as it were, one by one. He would invite them home, behave badly. And they began to tell each other, they began to share the secret with each other and found it hateful. And so they decided that they would all get together and as a group make a protest about this person. And they went to the head of department, and it eventually went up to, I think, as far as the controller. And the person was reprimanded, and then he was promoted.
Internally in the BBC?
Yes, but outside their orbit.
How high did he get in the BBC?
Pretty near the top. But the point is, women were getting together all the time and saying, this is intolerable. But there was no route for doing anything about it. There was no law against it. And indeed, it was almost accepted behavior. It was kind of, people would say, well, what do you expect? You know, I mean, people were jumped on in lifts. They were pinched as they went upstairs. Women were victims in a very low-level harassment. Pinching, nudging, squeezing, all the time. It went on all the time for most women. We didn't like it. We pushed it away. We learnt always to get in a lift and stand with your back to the wall. It was not an easy life, but I mean, it was part of the world in which we moved. It continued slowly until, as the late 60s began to see the rise of the strongly outspoken women. And also something else happened. The whole nature of abuse of women and women's refuges, women being beaten up, women having seriously attacked by their husbands or by drunken lovers or whatever. And that came to the fore. And I remember someone called Erin Pitsey setting up the first of the refuges. And at that point, everyone said, this is serious, this is a serious, and has been going on for a long time. Heaven knows it's all in Charles Dickens' novels. It's not as though it's something that's unknown. It's something that we are not putting up with. And, you know, women became seriously militant. I mean, there were strikes in factories when women wanted equal pay. 1970 was the Equal Pay Act, but it didn't bring equal pay. We had to lobby for it. I mean, this was all political. At that point, of course, I stayed very close to that kind of the changes in the law about that. I was in no position to represent or speak or in any way be active, but I was, by my votes and my thinking and the way I conversed with my friends, enormously behind all these movements to defend women and promote their interests, protect them and so on.
Did you vote Labour all your life then throughout? Did you ever vote for any other party?
No. I didn't vote Labour after Tony Blair led the invasion of Iraq. I abandoned the Labour Party at that point and didn't vote for them. I voted Green. So
you accepted a Labour peerage in 2011. That would have been Ed Miliband, I suppose, who gave that peerage to you?
When Ed approached me and asked if I would let my name go forward, I did say to him, but you do have a problem because I didn't vote Labour at the last election, and I'm still extremely angry. You'll be pleased to know, Tom, that I marched against the Iraq War with about 1 million other people, and that was an 8-hour day. I remember being very tired at the end of that. But I marched against the Iraq War with great passionate feeling that it was the wrong thing to do. So I wasn't going to vote Labour. I didn't support the Labour Party at that time. And I had to explain that to Ed Miliband. And I said, I'd like you to go away and consider whether you really want me to be a Labour peer. And I have to consider whether I want to be. So we agreed to speak again, at which point we both said, Ed said, yes, I would like you to. And I said, well, I will accept.
Let's talk a bit about the modern-day Labour Party then. It's seen quite a few evolutions over the last 5 or so years since Ed Miliband. You liked Ed? Did you vote for Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes. No, I didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn. I thought he was divisive in the Labour Party, and I thought the whole address of the party became too left-wing. That's not to say that I didn't think that the manifesto he drew up was excellent in many regards, and I thought that was fine. But I just felt that the way he conducted the affairs of the Labour Party and the people who surrounded him were taking it in a divisive direction.
Are you a socialist? Have you ever called yourself a socialist?
Yes, I believe in the nationalisation of the facilities of the country. I believe in gas and the railways and electricity. I believe they should all be nationalised. Yes, I believe in a large-scale nationalisation of public utilities, but I'm not. I think also, as a Keynesian, I think the flaws of capitalism are coming more and more to be demonstrated. And I think one of the great problems we have across the globe is the huge diversity of wealth now, the accumulation of sensationally huge incomes for a number of individuals and a super rich class who are living on investments that are in tax havens and so on. And the divergence of that from the really poor of the planet is something that's unsustainable for the human race. It shouldn't be tolerated. It's an immoral state of affairs. So I don't. So I see sort of capitalism as mightily flawed and not able to correct its failings, which makes me a strong social democrat.
So the modern day Labour Party, the modern day Labour leader, Keir Starmer, is he your kind of guy? Is he your ideal Prime Minister?
Well, I gave him my support when he was campaigning in Camden to be an MP, and I went out on the stump with him once or twice because he was DPP then, and so I spoke in his support.
Let's finish on social media. So you tweet a lot, and as we've just discussed, you reached the fantastic age of 87. I would contest there aren't many 87-year-olds who tweet quite as passionately and retweet as impassioned as you do. And I have to say...
I have to say that in terms of ideas and thinking and behaviour and parliament and politics and engagement, I don't feel that I'm an old 80s. I just feel that I'm a little bit infirm, but the same as I ever was. I feel, as spiritedly exercised about the fate of the country and the state of the nation as I ever did. I don't feel that those sentiments have aged in any way. I try to keep up to date with all the shenanigans. I'm enormously distressed by Boris's leadership of the country, which I think is deeply flawed and sometimes quite dangerous. So I stay tuned. I mean, I should be voting almost any minute now in the agricultural bill, which is before the House of Lords at the moment. I vote here on my laptop. I speak on my laptop. The House of Lords has got its act together, and I've got a question down for October the 5th. So I'm taking part, as we all are. The House of Lords is conducting debates in a very seemly and it's with its usual spirited degree of information, authority, and commitment. So I'm interested in all that, and I follow it. So naturally, it spills over into Twitter, where I express myself slightly more casually.
Let me just put the thought to you that your type of politics, moderate internationalism, centrism, has failed at the moment. Brexit won. The populists are in charge. Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro in Brazil. Some say Boris Johnson. Your brand is really out of fashion and out of power. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I don't like the idea of it being a brand, because I think it speaks across all parties to the sort of basic humanity of each of us. So I feel that I have a great deal in common, for example, with the sort of Tory that Boris Johnson threw out of the party when they opposed Brexit. I'm talking about people like Dominic Grieve, with whom I was enormously sympathetic, and that happens in the House of Lords. Of course, people have set aside their political ambitions and speak to their morality and their basic human understanding of how we should conduct ourselves.
Joan, this is the part, sometimes very tricky part, where we have to sum you up and tell you what we think your personality, politics actually is. I would say you're a campaigning feminist, social democrat, consensualist. How do you plead?
Oh, proud of that. Yes, I'm proud of that. I hope I don't lose the campaigning part of it. I don't want to just fade away. I want to stay alert to things that distress me, and also that distress many people. So I want to be on the side of people who need help.
Well, it sounds like you still are to me. Joan Bakewell, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.